Katie stood in her apartment, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. She was radiant, her face glowing with excitement as she adjusted the white lace veil she would soon wear down the aisle. Her wedding was just days away, and everything felt perfect. She smiled, thinking about Brad, her fiancé, her perfect match. Brad was successful, charming, and dependable. They were the couple everyone admired, and Katie had worked tirelessly to make sure their lives looked flawless. Around her, friends and family buzzed with excitement, discussing last-minute wedding details and teasing Katie about her soon-to-be married life. Katie's heart swelled with happiness. She'd always wanted this, the fairy tale wedding, the dream husband, the life everyone would envy. As her friends laughed and toasted to her future, Katie closed her eyes and took a deep breath, savoring the moment. She had no idea that everything she believed about her future was about to shatter. Katie's heart raced as she picked up Brad's phone, which he'd left behind at her apartment. She'd noticed it buzzing nonstop, and while she rarely looked at his messages, something urged her to check. The screen showed a message preview. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Last night was amazing." Katie's stomach twisted. She opened the conversation, finding a series of messages from an unknown number. Each message was flirtatious, filled with affection, and all clearly directed at Brad. Her hands shook as she scrolled further, discovering that Brad had been involved with multiple women. There were photos, plans, late-night rendezvous, and sweet nothings exchanged with people she'd never heard of. Katie's face paled, her mind racing as she pieced together the truth. Her heart pounded in disbelief, shock numbing her to everything around her. It felt like the ground had opened up beneath her, pulling her into a void of betrayal and confusion. She stumbled back, unable to believe the man she was about to marry, the man she trusted with her life, had been deceiving her. Memories of Brad's charm and tender promises flooded her mind, now tainted with doubt. Every word he'd ever spoken suddenly felt like a lie. Every kiss and moment shared now cheapened by his deceit. She sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the phone in her hands, unable to reconcile the man she loved with the stranger she now saw him as. Katie's vision blurred with tears, but behind the sadness was a surge of anger rising within her. She thought of the months of planning, the sacrifices, the dreams she'd woven around this marriage. Her chest tightened as the betrayal settled deep, fueling a rage she'd never felt before. Brad hadn't just broken her trust, he'd shattered the life they'd been building together. As tears rolled down her cheeks, Katie's sadness turned to resolve. She knew she couldn't marry him now, not after what she'd uncovered. Katie grabbed her keys and stormed out of the apartment, barely able to see through the tears streaming down her face. The sky matched her mood, dark and heavy, with rain pouring down as she stumbled to her car. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed to escape from the memories, the lies, and the life she thought she knew. The rain beat against the windshield as she drove through the empty streets, each drop blurring her vision more. Her mind spun, replaying every tender moment with Brad, every promise he'd made. They felt hollow now, mocking her as she realized how deeply he'd betrayed her. Katie gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady herself, but the shock and hurt were too overwhelming. She drove aimlessly, letting the rhythm of the rain calm her, if only slightly. Her world had been perfect, or so she thought, and now it felt as if it had crumbled in a single moment. Alone in the darkness, with nothing but the sound of rain and her own quiet sobs, Katie felt more lost than ever. Her fairy tale life was gone, replaced by a painful, aching void. Katie found herself at a dimly lit bar on the edge of town, a place she'd never been before. She stumbled to a stool, soaked from the rain, and waved the bartender over. Without a word, he slid a glass toward her. She took it gratefully, downing the bitter liquid in one go. She welcomed the burn, hoping it might dull the ache in her chest. She ordered another drink and another, her thoughts clouded by the faces and voices around her, each happy laugh like a stab to her heart. Her mind spun with memories of Brad, their plans, his promises, the life she thought she was building. She had given everything for them, played every part perfectly, and in return, he had shattered her trust without a second thought. By her third glass, Katie felt a sliver of the pain lift, though her heart still ached. But as she stared into her empty glass, a reckless, furious thought started to burn inside her, growing bolder with every bitter taste of betrayal. She clenched her jaw, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. No, she wasn't going to be the victim. If Brad thought he could control her, he had another thing coming. Staggering to her feet, she raised her glass to the empty air with a wild, defiant glare. "Fine, Brad," she slurred, voice dripping with anger. "If you think I need you, I'll prove I don't." She took a shaky breath, her voice rising, raw and unsteady. "I'll marry the first man I see. How about that?" She practically spat the words, her determination blazing through the haze of alcohol. The bartender glanced over, wide-eyed, but she paid him no mind. Her gaze was fixed on nothing and everything, daring the universe itself to challenge her. Katie stumbled out of the bar, the world around her spinning as she tried to steady herself. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets quiet and glistening under the streetlights. She took a shaky step forward, clutching her jacket close, lost in a haze of hurt and alcohol. "Need a hand?" A gentle voice broke through her foggy thoughts. Katie looked up, blinking through the blur, to see a man standing nearby. He looked rugged, with a warmth in his eyes that contrasted with his worn leather jacket and guitar case slung over his shoulder. "I'm fine," she mumbled, wobbling slightly as she tried to brush past him. But her legs gave way, and he quickly stepped forward, catching her before she fell. "Hey, easy there," he said, steadying her. "Rough night?" Katie felt a surge of embarrassment, but also something oddly comforting in his presence. She nodded slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could say that." The stranger smiled gently. "Look, I know we don't know each other, but maybe you shouldn't be wandering around alone like this. Let me make sure you get somewhere safe." Exhausted and too defeated to argue, Katie nodded, allowing him to guide her down the empty street. She had no idea who this man was, but in that moment, his quiet kindness felt like a lifeline. The next morning, Katie awoke to the soft light filtering through unfamiliar curtains. Her head throbbed, and as she sat up slowly, memories of the previous night began to surface. Brad's betrayal, the rain, the bar, and then a stranger's kind eyes. She looked around the modest apartment, spotting a worn guitar in the corner and sketches scattered on a table. "Morning," a voice greeted her from the doorway. Katie looked up, seeing the man from last night standing there with a steaming mug. He handed it to her, his smile warm and easygoing. "Figured you might need some coffee." Katie accepted the mug gratefully, feeling a bit self-conscious. "Thank you. I'm sorry for just showing up like that." "Don't worry about it," he replied, settling into the chair across from her. "Long night, huh?" Katie managed a small nod. "Yeah, something like that." She took a sip of coffee, allowing herself a brief moment of calm. Then she glanced back at him, a faint recognition sparking in her mind. "Have we met before?" The man chuckled softly. "I was wondering if you'd remember. We went to the same high school, Jake Andrews." Katie blinked, memories flashing back. Jake, the quiet guy who used to sit at the back of her English class, always sketching or tapping out rhythms with his pen. They'd never been close, but she remembered his gentle smile and the way he seemed lost in his own world. "Jake? Wow, it's been years," she said, a hint of amazement in her voice. "I didn't realize you lived around here." He shrugged, smiling. "I've been here a while. Just playing music, getting by, you know, the usual." Katie looked at him with fresh eyes, noticing the ruggedness that had developed over the years, the calm confidence in his demeanor. Jake had grown into someone intriguing, someone she hadn't expected to run into on a night like this. As she studied him, Jake hesitated, then spoke softly. "You know, I always kind of noticed you back then. You were a bit out of my league, though." Katie felt a blush rising in her cheeks, surprised by his quiet confession. "Really?" she murmured, both flattered and oddly comforted. Jake nodded, his gaze warm and steady. "Guess fate has a funny way of working things out." Katie sat with her coffee, letting Jake's words sink in. She glanced around his small apartment, taking in the details she hadn't noticed before. There was a stack of vinyl records, sketches pinned on the walls, and a couple of vintage posters for jazz festivals. It was clear this wasn't just some random space. It was filled with pieces of Jake's world. She smiled softly, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time. So, music, art? Looks like you've got a pretty creative life going here, she said, curiosity lacing her words. Did you always know you'd end up doing this? Jake chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. I guess I always wanted to. It wasn't exactly the path everyone thought I should take, though. He paused, a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. But life has a funny way of pushing you toward what matters. Katie felt a pang of admiration as she listened. Here was someone who had chosen a life of passion. Someone who followed his own path, no matter how uncertain. It was so different from the rigid, carefully planned world she'd lived in with Brad, where everything had to be perfect, measured, and controlled. Being in Jake's presence felt freeing, like she was finally allowed to breathe. And you? Jake asked, breaking her thoughts. I mean, I remember you were always the one with everything together. But last night, I saw a different side of you. Katie looked away, her fingers tightening around the mug. She didn't know how much she wanted to share, but something about Jake's open gaze made her feel safe. Yeah, I thought I had everything figured out. Turns out, I didn't know as much as I thought, she said quietly. Jake nodded, as if he understood far more than he let on. Sometimes the things we think are stable end up being the things that hold us back, he replied gently. It's okay to change course. Katie felt an unexpected lump in her throat at his words, a mix of relief and vulnerability. Here was someone who didn't see her as just Katie, the perfect fiancé, but as a person who could be more, who could choose her own path. As their eyes met, Katie felt a spark of something new, something thrilling yet calm, wild yet safe. She hadn't expected to feel this way, especially not with Jake. But here they were, two people with uncharted futures meeting at an unexpected crossroads. Katie spent the next few days in an unexpected routine. Every morning, Jake would swing by her apartment or text her with some casual invite. A walk through the park, coffee at a small cafe, or even just a quiet afternoon by the lake. She found herself saying yes, not out of loneliness, but because each encounter with Jake felt like peeling back layers of a world she'd never known. One afternoon, Jake suggested something different. How about exploring the city a little? I know a few spots that I think you'll like. Curious, Katie agreed, and soon they were winding through the quieter streets, away from the polished areas she was accustomed to. Jake led her to an alleyway where walls were painted with colorful murals stretching as far as the eye could see, faces, landscapes, abstract patterns. Katie looked around in awe, taking in the vibrancy of the art. This is incredible, she murmured, her fingers tracing the paint on the wall. How did I never know about this place? Sometimes you have to go off the main path to find the best things, Jake replied with a smile. Not everything worth seeing is on the map. From there, they drifted to a street where buskers played music, their tunes echoing softly through the open air. Jake stopped to listen, nodding his head to the rhythm. Without thinking, Katie grabbed his hand, pulling him closer to the performers. They swayed together, her laughter blending with the music, her worries dissolving with every note. It felt like a scene from a movie, except it was real, and she was living it with someone who understood her in ways she hadn't expected. They stopped by a tiny record store tucked into a corner of the city, where dusty albums and vintage records filled the shelves. Jake thumbed through the collections with the kind of reverence most people reserved for rare artifacts. This place has been here forever, he said, handing her an old jazz album. Some of my best finds have come from this shop. Katie held the record, feeling the smoothness of the cover and the weight of something cherished. She'd never thought much about vinyl, but seeing the joy in Jake's eyes as he picked out records, she felt a new appreciation. They bought the album and headed to a park nearby, where Jake pulled out a small portable record player from his bag. They sat on a bench as the music filled the air around them. Katie closed her eyes, letting the sounds wash over her. She could feel the warmth of the sun on her face, the grass beneath her feet, and the steady presence of Jake by her side. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt truly present, like each second mattered, like she didn't have to plan the next step. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything, Katie glanced at Jake. His gaze was soft, his smile unforced, and she realized he wasn't just showing her the city, he was showing her a new way to see herself. Here in this world he lived in, she wasn't confined to who she'd been with Brad. She was free to be anyone she wanted. In Jake's company, the city had come alive, full of color, sound, and discovery. And for the first time, she felt alive too. Katie sat by the lake with Jake, watching the sunlight dance across the water's surface. The gentle ripples, the open air, and the quiet laughter they shared created a sense of calm she hadn't known she needed. For years, her life had been meticulously planned, each day measured against the next goal, the next milestone. But here, with Jake beside her, she felt something she couldn't quite name, a weight lifting, a kind of freedom she hadn't allowed herself to feel. She stretched her legs out, leaning back on her hands, and let out a deep breath. "You know," she began, glancing at Jake, "I don't think I ever really stopped to just be. I was always racing towards something, always trying to make sure everything was perfect." Her voice softened as she looked back at the water, almost speaking to herself. "And for what?" Jake nodded thoughtfully, picking up a pebble and skipping it across the water. "Sometimes we're so busy chasing what we think we should want that we forget to actually live," he said gently. "I used to think I had to prove something to everyone around me, but after a while, I realized that I was only losing myself in the process." His words resonated deeply with Katie. She remembered all the years of striving, of trying to be the perfect partner, the perfect daughter, the perfect woman. She'd built her life around expectations, her family's, Brad's, even her own. But now, as she watched the ripples fade, she began to wonder if maybe it was okay to let go of perfection and simply let herself be. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, breaking the silence. "The idea of living up to what everyone else thinks you should be?" Jake gave her a small smile, shaking his head. "Honestly, no. Life's too short to live it for anyone else." He looked at her thoughtfully, his gaze soft. "The freedom you're feeling right now? That's real. It's you, without all the expectations. You should hold on to that." Katie felt her heart swell at his words, as if he'd reached into the part of herself she'd kept locked away for so long. She was beginning to understand that freedom wasn't just a matter of breaking away from Brad or moving past the betrayal. It was about learning to live in the moment, to let go of the need to control everything. She could feel the grip of her old life loosening, and it filled her with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. They spent the rest of the afternoon wandering along the lakeside, talking about everything and nothing. Katie laughed easily, her worries a distant memory, swept away in the simplicity of each passing second. The weight she'd carried for so long felt lighter, as if her soul had finally found a place to rest. As dusk settled, Katie realized she hadn't thought about Brad or her failed plans for hours. She hadn't been Katie, the perfect fiancé, or Katie, the reliable daughter. She had just been Katie, herself, unfiltered, unburdened. With a gentle smile, she looked over at Jake, grateful beyond words. In his company, she'd found a glimpse of the life she'd forgotten she could have, one filled with peace, laughter, and above all, freedom. The days drifted by in a quiet rhythm. As Katie and Jake spent more time together, their bond deepening with every shared moment. One evening, they sat on the rooftop of Jake's building, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky. The soft hum of distant traffic filled the silence, blending with the occasional strum of Jake's guitar as he absent-mindedly plucked a melody. Katie leaned back, breathing in the cool night air, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She glanced over at Jake, catching the look of concentration on his face as he played, his fingers moving effortlessly over the strings. There was a warmth about him, a gentleness in his presence that made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just attraction, it was a quiet understanding, a connection she felt deep within her soul. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, catching her gaze. Katie hesitated, then smiled. "I was just thinking how strange life is. A month ago, I thought I had it all figured out. And now, here I am on a rooftop with a guy I barely knew back then, and somehow, this feels more real than anything else." Jake set down his guitar, his gaze steady and open. "Sometimes the best things come when we're least expecting them," he replied, his voice low. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again, let alone get to know you like this." Katie's cheeks warmed, her heart beating a little faster. There was something about Jake that made her feel safe, seen, and understood in a way she hadn't felt in years. With him, she didn't have to pretend, didn't have to be perfect. She could just be herself, messy and uncertain, and somehow that was enough. Without thinking, she reached out, letting her hand rest on top of his. Jake looked down at her hand, then up at her, his eyes softening. Neither of them spoke, but in that quiet, unspoken moment, something shifted. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them on that rooftop, sharing a closeness that felt as natural as breathing. Jake leaned in, pausing just before his lips met hers, giving her the chance to pull away. But Katie didn't move. She felt the warmth of his breath, the quiet promise in his gaze, and closed her eyes as he kissed her. A gentle, lingering kiss that held the weight of all the unspoken feelings between them. It wasn't a kiss of passion or urgency. It was a kiss of trust, of quiet understanding, and the first spark of something deeper. When they pulled away, Katie's heart felt full, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She hadn't planned this. She hadn't even seen it coming. But looking into Jake's eyes, she realized that maybe love didn't always need plans or perfect timing. Sometimes, love was simple. Sometimes, it was about finding someone who could sit with you in silence, make you laugh without trying, and see you for who you truly were. In that moment, Katie knew she'd found something real. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she could start again. Jake was sitting outside a coffee shop, enjoying the quiet hum of the city, when he noticed a figure approaching from across the street. Brad. His sharp suit and determined stride immediately set Jake on edge. Jake put down his coffee, straightening as Brad stopped directly in front of him, his face a mixture of anger and disdain. "So you're the guy?" Brad said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The one who's been spending all this time with Katie." Jake kept his tone calm, though he felt his pulse quicken. "If you're here to talk about Katie, maybe we should get straight to the point." Brad scoffed, leaning in closer. "Let me make this simple for you. Katie's life is with me, not with some street musician who can barely keep a roof over his head." He looked Jake up and down, his eyes full of judgment. "What do you think you're giving her? You think she'd ever actually choose you?" Jake held Brad's gaze, unfazed. "I don't think this is about what Katie wants or needs, Brad. It's about what you want. You're not here because you care about her. You're here because she chose to walk away from you." Brad's jaw tightened, his voice growing colder. "You don't know anything about us. Katie is just confused. She'll come back. She always does. And when she does, you'll be nothing more than a memory." Jake stood, facing Brad directly. "Katie deserves to make her own choices, and if you really cared about her, you'd respect that." Brad smirked, taking a step back. "Here's my warning. If you don't stay away from her, I'll make sure you regret it. I have resources, influence. I could ruin you with a phone call." Jake's expression didn't waver. "Maybe you should think about why Katie left in the first place. Threats won't change what's already happened." For a moment, Brad's face flushed with anger, but he quickly masked it with a cold smile. "Fine," he said, his voice a low threat. "But don't say I didn't warn you." With one last glare, Brad turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing alone, knowing that Brad's words were only the beginning. As Brad disappeared down the street, Jake sat back down, his calm demeanor slipping away. He hadn't shown it in front of Brad, but now, alone with his thoughts, worry gnawed at him. He'd seen the look in Brad's eyes, cold, calculating, possessive. Brad wasn't going to let Katie go without a fight. Jake pulled out his phone, scrolling through his messages to see if Katie had texted him, hoping for some reassurance that she was safe. His fingers hovered over the screen as he hesitated, wondering if he should tell her about the confrontation. But he didn't want to add to her stress or make her feel trapped between them. Katie had already been through so much. The last thing she needed was more conflict. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The truth was, he'd never felt this protective over anyone before. Katie had become more than just a friend. More than a brief romance, she was someone he genuinely cared for, someone he wanted to see free and happy. But Brad's threats hung in the back of his mind, a dark cloud over every moment he and Katie shared. He knew that Brad wasn't bluffing. A man like him would do whatever it took to get what he wanted. Jake's jaw clenched as he realized he had to be careful, not just for his sake, but for Katie's. One thing was certain, he wasn't going to let Brad hurt her again, no matter the cost. Katie was on her way out of her apartment building when she saw Brad waiting by the entrance, his figure sharp against the soft morning light. Her heart sank, a mix of dread and anger rising within her. She hadn't seen him since she'd left, and she'd hoped she wouldn't have to. She took a deep breath and approached him, her posture firm. "Katie," Brad began, his voice calm but with an edge she hadn't heard before. "We need to talk." "I don't think we do, Brad," she replied, crossing her arms. "I've said everything I needed to say." Brad's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "I don't think you understand. This isn't over just because you decided it is. We had plans, a future. You can't just walk away from all of that." Katie forced herself to stand her ground. "I can, and I have. What we had was built on lies, Brad. I know everything." His jaw tightened and his voice dropped, taking on a cold, threatening tone. "If you walk away from me, I promise you'll regret it. I have influence, Katie, enough to make your life very difficult. Your career, your finances, everything you've built, I can tear it all down with one word." Katie felt a chill run down her spine, but she fought to keep her expression steady. "Is that really what you want, Brad? To control me through threats? That's not love." Brad's face twisted with a mixture of frustration and desperation. "You don't understand. You belong with me. I gave you everything, and you're just going to throw it all away for him?" Katie's eyes hardened. "Yes, I am, because for the first time in my life, I feel free. I'm done living under someone else's rules, Brad. I'm done living under your rules." Brad's expression darkened. "Fine," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but filled with venom. "But don't say I didn't warn you. I'll destroy everything if I have to." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Katie standing alone, shaken but resolute. Katie paced her apartment, Brad's threats replaying in her mind like a relentless echo. She tried to calm herself, but the fear clung to her, an unshakable weight pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced through everything he'd said, the ease with which he'd promised to ruin her life if she didn't return to him. She knew Brad well enough to understand that these weren't empty threats. His power, his connections, he could follow through without hesitation. She sat down, covering her face with her hands. Was this really her only choice? She'd finally tasted freedom, a glimpse of the life she could have, filled with honesty, laughter, and the promise of something real with Jake. Yet here she was, back at a crossroad she thought she'd left behind. She didn't want to give up everything she'd discovered, but she couldn't ignore the risk Brad posed to her career, her stability, her entire future. It wasn't just her life he could damage. It was her family, her friends, anyone he thought she cared about. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jake, checking in, asking if she was all right. She stared at the screen, her heart aching at the thought of him, the way he'd looked at her with nothing but acceptance, offering her something she hadn't dared to dream of before, a future built on trust. But could she really keep Jake safe from Brad's wrath? Was it fair to pull him into a battle he didn't ask for? Katie took a shaky breath, forcing herself to make a choice. She knew how much Brad's threats weighed over her, and the longer she resisted, the more real they would become. She couldn't bear to be the reason Jake's life was torn apart because of her. Maybe, she thought bitterly, she could endure Brad's control a little longer if it meant keeping Jake and everyone else out of harm's way. With a heavy heart, Katie typed a message to Brad, agreeing to meet him the next day. Her fingers hovered over the screen, feeling the loss before she even hit send. She closed her eyes, forcing back the tears. She was choosing safety, but it felt like surrender. As she pressed send, a hollow emptiness filled her. Jake sat alone, his mind swirling with thoughts of Katie and the threat Brad posed. He'd sensed something was wrong from her short, distant messages over the past few days, But now he knew without a doubt. Katie was pulling away. She hadn't told him directly, but he could feel it in her words, the way she avoided their usual calls, the way she seemed to be shutting him out. The thought of losing her gnawed at him, but he couldn't just sit by and watch Brad tear her life apart. Jake knew the kind of man Brad was. Cold, calculating, willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. But he also knew there had to be something in Brad's life that could take away his power. A secret, a vulnerability, something that would make him think twice before threatening Katie again. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him. He would leave, without telling Katie, to find out the truth about Brad. If he could expose something that would keep Brad out of her life forever, maybe Katie would finally be free to live as she deserved. But he knew that if he told her, she would try to stop him, fearing for his safety. And deep down, Jake understood that Katie was doing all of this because she thought it was the only way to protect him. With a heavy heart, Jake packed a small bag and scribbled a quick note, placing it on her doorstep. He didn't write much, just a few words to let her know that he cared, that he would be back soon, and that he hoped she would trust him enough to let him do this. His hands shook as he set the note down, thinking of all the things he wanted to say to her, all the moments they might have shared if life had dealt them a different hand. Jake cast one last look at her building, a quiet determination hardening in his chest. He was willing to risk everything if it meant giving Katie a chance to be free from Brad's control. With a final, reluctant glance, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night with a single purpose: to find the truth that could set Katie free. Katie found the note on her doorstep the next morning, her heart sinking as she read Jake's brief, careful words. There were no explanations, no promises, just a quiet goodbye with an empty reassurance that he'd be back soon. She read it over and over, her mind racing to make sense of it. Why would he leave so suddenly? Why hadn't he told her what was going on? Her chest tightened, the fresh wound of betrayal reopening in a new painful way. She trusted Jake, allowed herself to hope for a life with him, one filled with honesty and the freedom to be herself. And yet he'd left, just like that. After all their moments together, he was gone, without any clear reason or warning. She sank to the floor, clutching the note as a sense of abandonment washed over her. Katie's mind spiraled through doubts, her insecurities resurfacing. Maybe she'd been naive to think she could escape Brad's grip, or that Jake could truly understand what she was going through. The pain of his absence felt different from Brad's betrayal, deeper somehow, because with Jake, she'd finally felt seen. She'd believed he was different, that he cared enough to stand by her no matter what. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it, too heartbroken to face anyone else. A quiet anger began to simmer beneath her hurt. Had he realized the complications she brought into his life and decided she wasn't worth it? Had Brad's threats gotten to him, driving him away? The thought made her feel small and foolish, as if every dream she'd begun to build with Jake had been nothing but an illusion. Katie stared out the window, her heart aching with disappointment. She thought back to Brad, his possessive words and relentless threats. She hated the idea, but as the hours dragged on, she began to wonder if Brad was right, that no one would ever stay beside her when things got hard, that she'd always be too much trouble. By the end of the day, the emptiness in her heart settled into resignation. She couldn't fight this battle alone. If even Jake wasn't willing to stay, maybe it was time to accept her fate and return to the life she'd tried so desperately to leave behind. Several days later, Brad was sitting confidently in his office, overlooking the city skyline, when Jake entered unannounced. Brad's face twisted in surprise and then disdain as Jake approached him with a calm, determined look. "What are you doing here?" Brad asked, his voice dripping with irritation. Jake placed a thick envelope on Brad's desk, his expression unwavering. "I'm here to end this," he replied. "I know everything about you, Brad. I know about your offshore accounts, the bribes, the shady deals. It's all here." Brad's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the envelope, a flicker of worry flashing across his face before he forced a smile. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I do," Jake continued, his voice low and firm. You've made a career of manipulating people, controlling anyone who stands in your way. But this time, you're the one who's cornered. Brad scoffed, but there was an edge of desperation in his tone. You really think you can just walk in here and blackmail me? You're nobody, Jake, a street musician who stumbled into something he doesn't understand. Jake leaned forward, meeting Brad's gaze. This isn't about blackmail. This is about giving Katie her freedom. You've threatened her, controlled her, and hurt her for too long. And if you don't let her go, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've done. You think your connections will save you? Think again. Brad clenched his jaw, the calm confidence he always exuded beginning to crack. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. I'll destroy you, and I'll make Katie pay for every single thing you've done here today. Jake didn't flinch. You won't touch her again, he said coldly. Not if you care about keeping your entire empire from collapsing. I have enough evidence here to make sure you lose everything, Brad. And I'm prepared to hand it over to the press and the authorities if you take one more step toward Katie. Brad's face twisted in anger, but he was trapped, and he knew it. He looked down at the envelope, the realization settling in that Jake held all the power now. For a moment, he said nothing, his fingers tapping the desk as he weighed his options. Finally, with a low growl, he spat out, Fine, have it your way, but don't think you've won anything. Jake straightened, a look of quiet triumph in his eyes. This isn't about winning. It's about giving Katie a life free of fear. Leave her alone, Brad, and don't come near her again. With one last defiant glare, Brad snatched up the envelope and shoved it into a drawer, his expression dark and resentful. He knew Jake had outmaneuvered him, and the bitterness in his eyes was unmistakable. Jake didn't care. He'd done what he came to do. Without another word, Jake turned and walked out of Brad's office, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd finally set Katie free. Brad sat alone in his office, Jake's words still echoing in his mind. He stared blankly at the closed drawer where he'd shoved the envelope, his jaw clenched tightly. The damning evidence weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of just how precarious his situation had become. For the first time, he realized that he was at risk of losing everything he'd built. The carefully constructed image, the connections, the wealth, it could all crumble in an instant if Jake followed through on his threat. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts, thinking of people who could help. Lawyers, powerful friends, even those in the media who owed him favors. But as he looked at each name, he understood the grim truth. Jake held all the power now. Brad could fight it, but a public scandal would ruin him, and everyone in his network would abandon him the moment they smelled trouble. A wave of frustration surged through him. He'd always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms. Yet here he was, cornered by a street musician who had somehow managed to find his greatest vulnerabilities. And all of it, everything he'd risked and now had to relinquish, was for Katie, a woman he'd once thought he could keep under his thumb. Now she was out of reach, and he had no choice but to let her go. With a grimace, Brad finally accepted the truth. Jake had left him with no options. If he pursued Katie, he'd lose everything. And while his pride screamed at him to retaliate, his instincts told him to retreat, to salvage whatever was left of his life. In the silence of his empty office, Brad slumped back in his chair, his face dark with resentment. He wasn't used to losing, and the bitterness tasted worse than he could have imagined. But he knew this battle was over. Katie was gone, and he would have to accept it. With one last defeated sigh, Brad reached for his drink, swallowing hard against the bitterness of defeat. Katie sat on her couch, staring at the note Jake had left behind. She'd read it countless times, hoping for a hint, a clue to why he'd left so suddenly. Days had passed, and the emptiness in her heart had only deepened. She'd felt abandoned, cast aside when she'd needed him the most. But a knock on her door that evening shattered the silence. When she opened it, there he was, Jake, standing with a weary yet determined expression. Katie's breath caught as a surge of mixed emotions hit her, relief, anger, and confusion. "Where have you been?" she demanded, the hurt evident in her voice. Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with quiet resolve. "Katie, I had to leave. I needed to protect you from Brad. The confusion on her face softened into surprise. Jake explained everything: his confrontation with Brad, the evidence he'd gathered, and the risk he'd taken to finally ensure her freedom. As he spoke, Katie felt the weight of each word. He hadn't left because he wanted to. He'd left because he needed to keep her safe, even if it meant facing Brad alone. Realization washed over her, and her heart swelled with gratitude and something deeper: love. Jake had risked everything, not just for her safety, but for her happiness. He'd faced Brad, taken on his threats, and put himself in harm's way just so she could be free from the grip of her past. Katie's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, truly seeing the depth of his care, his strength, his selflessness. She felt overwhelmed by the understanding that Jake hadn't abandoned her at all. He'd fought for her in ways she hadn't realized. Everything he had done was to protect her, to give her the freedom she'd almost given up on. "Jake, I thought you'd left me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jake took her hands, his gaze steady and gentle. "Katie, I could never leave you. Not for anything. I'd do it all again if it meant you'd be safe." Katie felt a tear slip down her cheek as she held his hand tightly. In that moment, she knew this was love, real, unwavering love, born from sacrifice and understanding. Jake had shown her what it meant to be truly cared for, and she knew she would never have to face the darkness alone again. Katie stood in her small living room, Jake's hand still wrapped in hers, the warmth of his presence flooding her heart. Everything she'd been through, the betrayal, the loss, the doubts, all of it seemed to fade away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace and gratitude. She looked at him, truly looked, and felt a joy she'd never known before. A laugh bubbled up from within her, soft at first, then fuller, until she was laughing through tears. Jake looked at her, slightly taken aback, but smiling. "What's so funny?" he asked, his voice gentle. Katie shook her head, wiping a tear from her cheek. "It's just, I never thought I could feel this happy, this free. For so long, I thought love was something I had to earn, something that came with conditions, with rules and limits." Her voice softened, eyes shining with emotion. "But you've shown me what love really is. It's simple, and it's here, right now." Jake pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as she leaned into him, feeling safe and whole in his embrace. The weight she'd carried for so long, the expectations, the need to be perfect, the fear of being alone, melted away as she stood there, held by the one person who had truly seen her, flaws and all, and stayed. They stayed like that for a while, savoring the quiet joy of the moment, the simplicity of just being together. The world outside felt distant, and for once, Katie didn't worry about the next step or what might come tomorrow. All that mattered was now, was Jake, and the incredible love they'd found amidst the chaos. She looked up at him, her smile widening. "Thank you, Jake, for everything. For showing me that I don't have to be anything but myself to be loved." Jake smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to thank me, Katie. Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were tears of pure happiness. She realized that for the first time in her life, she was truly, completely happy, content, not because of some perfect plan, but because she was finally free to love and be loved without fear. As the evening settled around them, Katie felt like her life had truly begun, a new chapter filled with hope, laughter, and a future she could face with courage and joy. In the months that followed, Katie and Jake set out on a journey that neither of them had fully planned, yet both had always dreamed of. They'd spoken about it in quiet conversations. Katie's long-buried wish to travel, to see the world without restrictions, and Jake's desire to make a difference through small acts of kindness. Together, they began to bring those dreams to life. Their first stop was a small coastal town where the sunsets painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Katie had never felt such freedom, walking along the beach with Jake by her side, each day unfolding without expectations. She marveled at the simplicity of it, the beauty in just being present, and the thrill of experiencing new places together. It was as if every worry she'd once carried had been lifted, leaving her open to all that the world had to offer. One morning, they volunteered at a local community center where Katie spent hours reading to children while Jake played his guitar, filling the room with soft, joyful melodies. The children laughed and clapped along, their faces lighting up with excitement. Watching Jake interact with them, Katie felt a warmth in her heart, knowing they were creating memories not just for themselves, but for others as well. From town to town, they embraced the chance to connect with people, just to immerse themselves in new cultures. In one city, they helped paint a mural for an underfunded school, brightening up a drab building with vibrant colors. In another, they spent their afternoons serving meals at a shelter, listening to the stories of people who had been through hard times and found resilience. Each act brought them closer, deepening their connection and their sense of purpose. At night, they'd return to their modest accommodations, sharing stories about the day's adventures and dreams for the future. Often, they'd find a quiet rooftop or a secluded park where Jake would strum his guitar and Katie would sing along, her laughter echoing through the night. They were living life on their terms, free from the expectations that had once confined them. As the months went on, Katie felt herself becoming braver, more confident. She no longer worried about perfection or meeting anyone else's standards. She had finally stepped into a life of her own making, and each new experience only strengthened the love she felt for Jake. Together, they created a rhythm of their own, one that allowed for mistakes, growth, and boundless joy. One evening, sitting on a hill overlooking a sprawling cityscape, Katie turned to Jake, her eyes bright with gratitude. "This," she said softly, gesturing to the world around them, "this is everything I've ever wanted but was too afraid to reach for." Jake took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You've had it in you all along, Katie. I'm just glad I get to be here with you while you discover it." They sat in comfortable silence, the city lights sparkling below them. Katie realized that this was just the beginning, that she and Jake had a lifetime of moments like this waiting ahead, a lifetime of love, laughter, and a world of possibilities, all within reach. Years later, Katie and Jake found themselves settled in a small, charming town that felt like a perfect mix of everything they loved. It was a place where the seasons changed vividly, the streets were lined with friendly faces, and the sounds of music and laughter seemed to linger in the air. They had created a life filled with warmth and simplicity, built around shared dreams and the joy they discovered together. Their days were a blend of passion and purpose. Jake had opened a small music studio where he taught local kids to play guitar, encouraging them to find their own voice through music. The studio became a haven for the community, a place where kids, teens, and even adults came to share their love for music. Katie loved watching him work, seeing the kindness and patience he offered to each student. Katie, too, found her calling in helping others. She started a nonprofit that supported young writers and artists, offering workshops and resources to encourage them to express themselves. It felt like a full circle moment for her, a chance to give back and foster the kind of creativity that Jake had unlocked in her. Together, they hosted community events, bringing people together through art, music, and storytelling. Their home had become a gathering place filled with laughter, creativity, and connection. Evenings were their time to unwind together, a cherished part of their routine. They'd often cook dinner side by side, turning up the music and dancing around the kitchen, savoring the simple moments that had become the foundation of their happiness. Katie would sometimes catch Jake watching her with a soft smile, as if he were still marveling at the journey that had brought them here. After dinner, they'd head outside to their small backyard, where they'd set up a cozy spot to stargaze. Under the vast sky, they'd talk for hours, sharing dreams, memories, and their hopes for the future. Katie would rest her head on Jake's shoulder, feeling a deep, unshakable peace. She no longer felt the need to chase a perfect life or meet anyone else's expectations. She had found the truest form of happiness, one built on love, respect, and the freedom to be herself. On one particularly clear night, as they lay under a blanket of stars, Jake took her hand and kissed it softly. "Thank you, Katie," he murmured, his voice filled with warmth. "For choosing me, for choosing this life together." Katie smiled, squeezing his hand. "No, Jake, thank you. You showed me a world I never knew I needed, a life I never thought I deserved." They looked at each other, both understanding that this right here was everything they'd been searching for. It wasn't grand or extravagant. It was a life rich in love, in quiet joy, and in the peace of knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. As they sat there, watching the stars in comfortable silence, Katie felt the fullness of their journey settle in her heart. She knew they'd face challenges, ups and downs, but she also knew they would face them together. And in that moment, she felt a love so complete, so enduring, that she knew it would carry them through a lifetime of happiness.